Okay, so last week we looked at, in particular, Durkheim and Merton. Okay, now Durkheim was writing at the same time as G. Stanley Hall, and G. Stanley Hall said all the turmoil that's going on in society is stuff happening within the young people. And that's why we're seeing problems like deviance played out within crime, youth suicide, kids going rampant on the streets and everything. But Durkheim wrote at the same time. He said, no, those behaviours, and he would have not used this term, it would have been used later on, latent, unwanted, those behaviours are functions that occur when society breaks down. So when society completely breaks down, you can expect that people haven't got social institutions that they can attach themselves to. They haven't got certainty in the pathways that they can take in life. And all of this uncertainty leads to increased deviance. So he would say suicide is something that occurs through a societal picture, not through an individual picture. And we looked at those graphs. We had that one graph that showed New Zealand across the world and how our youth suicide rates are really high, and then another one that showed it over time. And then I went off on my little, the 80s was the most evil period in history, and also agreed that the 70s brought the 80s. And I always acknowledge that the 60s brought, so we are living in a snowball of history. And so when we're working in the youth sector in particular, sociologists would say history matters. Treaty matters even more today. And I love how in the research methodologies that treaty is seen as a doorway to address injustice. So rather than going, this is a living document, and so therefore how do we work in partnership with iwi, and I say we as Pākehā working, no. And within a kaupapa Māori research framework, the treaty is a doorway in which injustice has to be addressed. And I find that a much more healthy and settling approach than going, what are the tokenistic tick boxes that are needed to ensure we have a treaty-based program. So it would acknowledge where it fits in the whakapapa. Very important, a sociologist would say, in New Zealand, the 70s are incredibly important because of the dawn raids. And that to understand the Pacifica picture today, even if the Pacifica children of today were not born in that period, or even if their parents didn't come to New Zealand in that period, or they didn't come to New Zealand in that period, you cannot understand Pacifica culture in New Zealand and the picture of youth development for Pacifica kids without knowing about dawn raids. Because the dawn raids enabled a whole lot of injustice to occur. And then we would also say that for our Asian, particularly Chinese. You know, we've had policies of discrimination right through to the 70s, anti-Asian, anti-Chinese. So you can't really understand the picture of where Chinese youth and why we don't even talk about youth development initiatives for Chinese youth. That's why they silence things, because we're still silent of the injustice of the past. So Durkheim started to get us thinking this way. And then Merton, which we'll return to in the next slide, he goes, yes, it is all about function, and he'll start to use terms like latent function as well. So a latent function is an unexpected one. So a function of education is to make workers. A latent function is some people are going to be unemployable. It's not wanted. A manifest function is that they actually have become workers. So by you can see that function. So Merton is going, okay, every society has particular goals, but not everyone's got those resources to get there. So that's why he came up with this idea here. That some of us will be able to conform, some of us will end up in a ritual, some of us will innovate, some of us will retreat, some of us will rebel. Now I love these guys, and I love Merton in particular because I'm like, youth workers should really be in that innovation space, or the rebellion space, or working with knowledge in the conformity space. So if I'm happening to be a youth worker in, what's the school that's across the harbour, the Bourne East School? That college? What's that? Wellesley.
Oh, Wellesley.
Yeah, so if I happen to be in Wellesley as a youth worker working with the young guys there, then I would actually know that, hey, these guys have got privilege. I would actually know the white privilege that box has got. So I wouldn't be saying this is a wrong place to be. I would be saying we need to know and acknowledge our white privilege. The kids in Upper Eastbourne, known as Wainuiamata by some, we call it Upper Eastbourne, and on a good day, Eastbourne's known as Lower Wainui. It's all in the name. We would be really clear when we're working alongside those young guys that not all kids in the Wellington region have access to the means and resources to actually have the same pathways in life. And you'll find some of the most amazing social justice initiatives working with privileged kids, privileged white kids, when youth workers are working sociologically, because these kids work in understanding. I mean the kids themselves. And some of you will know Chloe Beasley Wright, who is a BYD graduate. She was working with some kids, and it was quite interesting. I got to observe her, how these young white, in the main female, were actually actively around a table talking about their privilege. And because they had privilege, what could they sacrifice? And I thought that's a real example of sociological youth work in that box. We can conform, but we have to recognise the other needs. But if we're not in a space where we've actually got the means and the resources, why not innovate rather than force the kids into that box? So when we were at Wainui High School, rather than saying, you must do 2 hours NCEA a night, and I know this is true, I know kids in Wainui do not all kids have access to the internet at home. So I wouldn't be the youth worker saying you've got to do 2 hours, knowing that the maths teacher has given them only 2 hours online homework. I'd say, do you want to get through NCEA? The kid looked at me like tears and says, yeah. I'd say, well, do you actually have access to what you need at home? No. Okay, well, what say we talk the teacher into starting a maths club up? Because the teacher's put this expectation on you. Let's see if the teacher's prepared to help you and resource you. And I actually know that teachers have said yes at Wainui for that. What about the library that's got free computers? When's your short day at school? Wednesday. Okay, well, why not between 1 and 5 on a Wednesday go to the library and see if you can kick out all your NC? So innovating within the spaces that are there and finding the resources, because innovation doesn't always have to be crime.
No.
Okay, and then the rebellion box, I'm like, this is the cliff box. It is, mate. Because you are going to end up doing new things, making new paths, and your kids are going to have new dreams, aren't they? It's not going to be, let's play it to the New Zealand system. Let's create a microsystem that's going to be self-functioning. That's where I see your dream is, even though you only share parts of it to me. Because in this box, it is really about going, okay, this system doesn't work out here. How do we create a system that is separate to that system that does work for these young people? Oh look, this is you with the guides. It's not working in New Zealand. I'll go off to the islands and get it done. I'll create my own micro. I was going to say orgasm, but that's not micro.
You're the girl guides.
But at the end of the day, the Merton and Durkheim and the Chicago School, all they are interested in is the function of institutions and the function of behaviours that come out of those institutions. They just want to know the purpose, that's all. You can use this to explain inequality, but they won't question inequality. They're not saying inequality needs to change. And that would be the inherent problem of this approach, that inequality is not the problem. Okay, so there's another set of theorists, and they're called the conflict theorists. And they are basically like, our society has two groups of people, those with power and those not with power. And the ones with power are the ones that actually own the resources of production. The ones without power are their slaves in any form of way. Marx does this really, really well, and I would really point out that Marx and communism are two separate things. Communism comes from Marx, but isn't really fully his complete, not the way we saw it played out. Marx talked about, in traditional society, you would work on a farm, or work in a field, or work on an island, or work in a community, And whatever you did, you would own the means of at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So you could be planting kumara. You might be sharing it amongst all the families, but you were the person that owned the kumara in a way. Even if it was a communal sort of way, it was sort of you had control of the kumara. You touched everything you did. You knew the kumara inside out. Marx said that factories took that connection away. It alienated people from their labour. So rather than, and a really good example on this is your phone. Do you know who made your phone? The actual people. There would have been, I imagine, thousands of people involved in some way, right from the design aspect. Only the company knows in full how that phone's made. Every person along the production line only knows how to make their bit. Not a single person can make one phone. You've got your battery specialist, you've got your chip specialist, you've got your board specialist, you've got the phone design specialist, the glass specialist, you've got your app specialist. Every single one is only connected to that part, and the only people that own the production phone is, say, like Apple or Samsung or whatever the company is, they're the ones that own it. Everyone else is enslaved in some way to them. And it's like an enslavement, because you may get money for it.
No recognition.
No recognition. You know, and you think about it, the way your relationship is with your phone compared to the way your relationship may be with something that has been made for you as a child. I've got at home a teddy bear that my parents got divorced, and it's made out of a sheepskin, and it's stuffed really hard, and I wouldn't throw it around the class. It looks like a poo bear. It probably was made for it as a poo, but it's rock solid hard. We're talking classic old medicine ball hard. And it came with me from Turangi when my parents divorced to Westport. That teddy bear was made for me by a prisoner in the Turangi prison. My dad used to work there, and he had a daughter, and he wanted to make his daughter a present, but back then he couldn't do that, and he couldn't get the daughter a present. So to symbolise that, he made it for me. So every stitch he did was for this little 4-year-old. When the arms came off as a kid, because the arms did come off, I was in absolute tears. So my grandfather got a bit of number 8 wire and put the arms back on, and I still got that teddy bear.
Cool.
I know the story behind the teddy.
Yeah.
I've still got, my husband's still got this airplane that's made out of a bit of 4x2 with a flat piece of wood on top and a propeller, made for him by his dad. But we've gone through so many phones, so many computers, because in the whole process everyone gets alienated from the story and nothing becomes important anymore. The other side of it that Marx would point out is at the end of the day, the cost of labour for the people that make the phone is way less than the phone itself. So that's what he would mean by that enslavement. At the end of the day, it's not all equal. And I was thinking about this with the warehouse. They've just shut down in Wainui.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the warehouse have to draw a profit. It's not about drawing even. They're not going to draw a profit from Wainui, so shut it down. That's how capitalism works, according to Marx. And so it doesn't benefit everyone, and particularly when he predicted, he was writing in the 1800s, he predicted the equality income gap that we have now. He said, basically, he didn't know about New Zealand, but if a country like New Zealand ever decided to let go of being a welfare state like it was in the 1960s and 70s and become a neoliberal state where the market would be fully in control, then you will see the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and it won't get any better. And the poor will be blamed for their poverty, and they'll be shamed for their poverty. They'll be made to feel like they are the cause of their poverty. That is conflict theory. And then we talked about this way back in the beginning. So you got Marx saying, this is how it's all set up. And then Gransky said, and they will be made to, and they will believe that they are the cause of their poverty because the hegemony, the story that they've been told, the false lie that they've been told, they believe. I was talking to the first years, I didn't finish the end of the story, about when Arden and I had the privilege of working with WINS people. And we had this activity, and we had to do a session on identity development, and we called it Socket to the System, because this is where I come from. And we laid out all these cards on the floor, as we do, you know us, and these were the cavemen cards, and we're like, what symbolises you? And people chose some, and then we got them to do a continuum. Does a job define you, or is it something else? Most people would say a job would define you, because they're used to this. Kia, your name's Cliff, eh? What do you do as a job? In New Zealand, every second question tends to be, what do you do as a job, or where are you from?
Yeah.
And the what you do as a job question is potentially a shaming question. Oh, I don't really work at the moment. I'm unemployed.
Yeah.
And so our socking it to the system session was about getting these people to start to question the fact that they'd been sold a lie, that because they didn't have an identity through paid employment, they had no identity at all. And they had been long-term unemployment, so you're talking people 30 years. And before the session had started, because I'm a state house block kid, I was rattling and raving to Arden, I don't know how he coped with my waffling, about what an honour it was to be working with WINS clients, and about growing up in a WINS neighbourhood, and about it being like a marae. Everyone's house was open. Yes, there was child abuse everywhere, and I'm not saying that's on a marae, but everyone's house was open in the state housing block on Westport. Everyone was an auntie and uncle. If my cupboards were empty, I'd go and raid someone else's. If their cupboards were empty, they'd come and raid ours. So, and in the 1980s, that was the greatest thing to have in our state housing block, because no kid went hungry. The neighbours looked out for them. So, I saw it as a huge honour. And at the end of the day, we had them in the circle, giving back to us in that liminal moment. And they said, and this is a huge lesson, they said, we were outside that door listening to you, because we didn't know this at the beginning, that where we didn't have glass walls. And I was like, uh-oh, we heard that you said it was an honour. And we started to talk about it, and we said that it wasn't an honour because we're garbage. We're nothing. And the aim of the session was for them to realise it wasn't a job that would define them, it was a vocation, what your call in life to be is. And then at the end of it, they said, look, and we've done this session with you, and now we know it was an honour to be with us. And that's, like, to me that was like a powerful story, but that was like, that's what Gramsci would say, they'd been sold a lie. They had been unemployed for 30 odd years and been told it was their fault and that they were nothing. And that they had to do this course and had to do a session on identity to find out who they were so that they could actually get a job. And it wasn't just us that did the socket to the system. Justine did a bit on a session with them, and Justine ran the whole program, so you can imagine what ended up happening. But she did a session on them about ethics in the workplace, and it ended up all being on colonisation to Treaty Waitangi. So, but and anyway, so some of them are working down there now in full-time employment. And they don't see that as actually, when they're doing the road directing, they don't see that as their vocation. And that's the important thing. I don't mind turning a lollipop sign, because my vocation is something else. What I'm called to do is something else. And I said to the first years, I didn't tell them the end of the story. I said, I'm called to be a youth worker, and no matter where I am, no matter what I'm doing, that will be what I'm doing for the rest of my life, from the cradle to the grave. And then I add to that, part of it is being a Christian youth worker to me as well, because that's part of my identity as well. But yeah, Gramsci is like, that when we believe that lie, then it has to be that way. I don't believe New Zealand society needs to be as broken as it is. And that's what this course wants to challenge too. Do you want to accept the brokenness that you work in? Or do you want to change the brokenness that you work in? Gramsci points out that one of the ways that you can actually question the brokenness is to not do the BYD. That's what he means by the organic intellectual. He says there are two types of intellectuals. There's one that goes to a place on the hill called Welltech or VUW and gets a degree. They're just your Joe Blow intellectual that goes and does the thinking. And then there are those on the street who are doing it every day, who people follow and look up to, who are wise as wise as wise. They're the organic intellectuals. Cliff, that's you. T, that's you. Jess, that's you. Aris, that's you. CJ, that's you. Ola, that's you. You can hold on to that and still have a degree. Okay, and some of you have had this already with Arden, but Bourgeois would then go, and these are all Marxist things about the conflict theory, would say how the divide between the rich and the poor is done is through capital. Not just economic capital, but social capital, the connections that you have around you, and cultural capital. And to give you a recall of what Arden would have said about cultural capital, is that the school system is set up so that when young Pākehā privileged kids, and I add that privileged in so that we realise that there are different types of privilege, and there are those Pākehā kids who are not privileged. So when young Pākehā privileged kids go to school, they've got everything at their disposal to succeed. They can even speak the language of the teacher. But when young Pacific Island Māori go to school, it's a completely foreign environment. The stories that are given at school are the stories that will be ones that are attractive to the young Pākehā privileged. So you could go to school, and we talk about this I think on Thursday, and in school you might hear about the great navigators of the world today at school. But you will not hear about the Navigator Islands. And I wonder if any of you know where the Navigator Islands are. It's a test. So the original, that James Cook named a place in the Pacific the Navigator Islands, and he did that because he saw the greatest navigators he'd ever met came from those islands.
Oh.
They could navigate the Pacific like that. They didn't need to have all his tools. That was Samoa. So it was named by James Cook as the Navigator Islands. Yeah, and so imagine what would happen. I speak to those of you who have got Samoan or Pacific heritage. You went into a classroom and you were told the story of the Navigator Islands and the people there who were seen for their wisdom and navigation skills. You can't bring me when I'm teaching. I don't even know who Grant Herman is. We also have this thing that says busy. So you're in the classroom and you're learning about the great navigators. Imagine what it would be like if you heard about Kupe, the great Māori navigator who came from Hawaii down here and the places he went. And then you heard of, I've lost his name again, from the Cook Islands. Is it Te Paia?
Yeah.
Yeah, who assisted James Cook as he went through the islands, of the wisdom and everything he got when he went to Samoa, and of his desire to call that space the space of navigation, the space of wisdom in the Pacific. That would be a cultural, even though it would be all done in English, just imagine, but that would be inclusive of every one person in the classroom. When I went to school, and hopefully this has changed, but I learned that New Zealand was discovered by Abel Tasman and then navigated by James Cook. I knew nothing about Māori navigation because it was never taught to me until I discovered my uncle's Whitbix card collection from the 1950s, and one of the Whitbix cards on it had Kupe. And I went to school and I asked the teacher about Kupe, and the teacher said, that's not a question, that's about a myth. And that was the answer. And yet here in Te Papa, we've got one of the anchors. So, yeah, that's at us and them, and that disassociation between cultural capital. If the school doesn't align to the cultural aspirations at home, in your family, in your ainga, in your whānau, it's just not going to, the two connections don't work. It's resourced only to benefit one group. It's getting better. I know we'll say that, even as a teacher. And we go into some of the movements that have done that, but the Kura Kaupapa Hangaraya movement, which started in New Zealand, has been a game changer internationally and actually addressing this area. But it's still judged by those in power as being lesser than. They get away from everything, you know, the Kura Kaupapa. They don't even have to teach science. And did you know when the Maori kids go on, and please don't be offended because I'm doing this is how Pākehā we talk. When the Maori kids go on to do NCEA, they don't do the normal NCEA. It's the normal NCEA. They do cultural subjects. What good is that going to give them in life? Now I want you to ignore just that bit at the top here, but conflict theories, this is what they should actually say, subcultural theories, and we've covered a lot of this already, so I'm not going to actually talk too much into this because you've had this from me. But the Chicago School with the function theories, and you've got Thrasher and Albert Cohen, gangs and subcultures, this would all come out from, but from conflict theories, they see subcultures not as a function, but as an act of resistance of trying to change the system.
So like a trend?
Punk's a good example of a Birmingham school subculture. If you're going to say I'm going to have to wear nice, clean, new jeans, then F you.
Yeah.
I'm going to put some rips in mine. Hip-hop's a good example of that sort of subculture too. Because there's an active voice of resistance saying change is needed. And recently, and I'm just going to the recent stuff of subcultures, there's a lot of questioning within sociology about whether we should be still using terms like subcultures for young people. I'm a bit hesitant on removing it all completely, so I'll explain what they're sort of talking about. They're saying that we should move towards something like tribes or scenes. You may have heard some of those terms like the emo scene or the rave scene or rave tribes. I find that they're more encompassing of those that have got a lot of resources. They're not really, that they take, when you talk about them as scenes and tribes, you take away any voice of resistance. They're just sort of like a trend, you follow? And then there's another trend that's going down saying, well, actually, you could become, you can actually create your own identity completely. So this is too simplistic. But I'm like, for young, marginalised young people, subcultures play still a very strong part. Hip-hop being one, emo being another that's sort of faded out. But we do have subcultures where young people are actively trying to show a voice of where they're at and how they want to resist things. Oh, I can do that. Okay, this is the final slide that I've got the matrix up here because this is where I started to do my work in sociology. And these words here, Foucault, you know, when you hear me always going, knowledge is whakapapa, the person who first said that was Foucault. So you'll get more of Foucault a bit later on, but Foucault was the person who said, everything that you see today, if you're going to talk about democracy, find the whakapapa of democracy. Do not actually take it for granted as a concept that stands now. Look at its whakapapa, and if you do, you'll see that democracy wasn't actually what government by the people for the people. Democracy originated in Greece as government by the elite for the people. So it's had very different meanings. And then if you go to the whakapapa of democracy in New Zealand, the first people that had the vote were white males. Then they sort of said any male who owned land could vote, but not if they owned land in a collective sense. So that excluded many Māori men. And so then, you know, the right for women to vote came in later on, so it's always been a fight. Those who can't vote, you know, government by the people for the people should involve youth, but it doesn't. So he would say, always look at the whakapapa. Syed is a post-colonialist, and he would say, don't just look at the whakapapa, But look at what colonisation has done in the picture. And look at challenging the stories of colonisation. Look at what's actually going on for the colonised and the coloniser. And Wittgenstein would say, look at the language games. Look at the words that have been used and bandied around. Look at how Pacific Island people or people might be called dole bludgers. But white people who've just come out of a job might be called job hunters. So look at the language games that are getting used around disadvantage and advantage. And when you do that, you realise that topics like adolescence and young people, they're not a natural thing, they're a social construction. That is, they've been invented in knowledge. And I've already said this to you guys. If you go back to like 1840, the word adolescent didn't exist. It came out of the writing of G. Stanley Hall. The word teenager was socially constructed in the 1950s to talk about a consumer group. The word youth at risk was constructed in the 1970s to talk about young people going off the rails. Youth participation was constructed in the 1990s to try and enable some form of change. So all of these have arisen through our use of language and time and reaction to space. So inequalities, we want to know the whakapapa behind them. And I've already talked about all of that. So any questions about the deep of this stuff, the depth of this stuff?
I suppose you've just given us a whole bunch of theorists that look at it from all different angles, whether it be the inner, the outer, the around.
And that's what this course is, this whole program's about. You get given at first all the inner theories. That's what the